But anyway, as we'll see as we unfold it, tonight's more of a thought piece. It's sponsored by the Gardyns and the Frankels, Doctor and Doctor, good friends of mine. And truth is, as we say, as we're rounding near towards the end of this, I can tell you, one of the most, personally speaking, one of the interesting things is I speak to people around the country on different matters and all that, and they've heard about this, and they always say, we don't have this in the other cities and all that. And they always say like this, hey, get the federation and to do this, all the rest. And I always tell them, I said, we get our, have to find private sponsors. And they're amazed that we do so. But Baltimore is an unusual community in that regard. And Baruch Hashem for that. We are, some people ask me, and in that spirit, just want to show you, we're finishing this series tonight. And Susan was already asking me what's the next one. And I'm hoping, Mitzvah Hashem, in the summer to do one in July time, more or less the 3 weeks. The dates are not hard and fast, but as you can see over there, what I envision is a series of 6 talks on the war against the Jewish book, which is the history, the serious one, of what's been done to our books, burning and otherwise, censorship, corruption. It's the price of being a Jew and trying to have your own culture in a very difficult set of environments, which are not like the United States of America. And a lot of violence and a lot of stuff has been done to our books, so much so that a lot of what we read is actually distorted, either, Svarim is distorted either on purpose or through outside intervention or other reasons down today. So the story of the rape of the Jewish culture in the Jewish book is, I think, a compelling story. As you see, these are tentative dates over there. War Against the Jewish Book. You can see the titles yourself. Ignorance is Bliss is my favorite. And but right now, we need sponsors for this. So if anybody wants to make my life easy and do the whole series, please step forward tonight or some other time, and you'll just make my life easier. But seriously, all those are inspired, as you know, in order to make this happen for the Baltimore Jewish community in general. We need our help, and I do appeal to those who are so inclined, or to others, to think about this, because this is what I would like to do if it would be possible in the summer. I also want to call your attention real quickly. Circulate, Jacob moved the things around. We're going to try to make this Italy trip work, but and we have it down to a pretty good price, $3,500, which includes a lot of things. And it's going to be a whirlwind trip. Those of you who've been with me before know it's sunrise to sundown. But if anybody's interested, we have like a February, in order to get this price, which is a great price, we need a February 15th deadline. So if anybody, talk about it, think about it if you're so inclined. And but if so, in order to nail this price down, I can guarantee it till February 15th, and afterwards I cannot. If anybody's interested, contact me or my wife, or Ibe Elbaum for that matter. He's helping coordinate this as well. He'll be back very soon. And as I say before, we do have big plans. The flyers should be circulating around. Many of you, I hope everybody, will have access to one of the flyers. If not, ask the person next to you. And I would like to put together a nice group. And if it'll be possible, I think it'll be, I hope and I trust it'll be a unique experience because it's Jewish Italy, of course, I'm interested in. And I'm interested in Michelangelo stuff as Michael Schwartz, in other words, which is Michelangelo's original name. Not too many people know about that. There's a reason not too many people know about that, but nevertheless, as you can understand, Jews have been in Italy for thousands of years. Literally thousands of years. The main history for our culture is the last 500-600 years. And that's what I hope to be concentrating on this trip. So again, if it at all is something you're interested in, don't wait a month or two, because I can't guarantee the price then. Think about it seriously and try to get in touch with me in the nearer future rather than the far future. I think that covers everything. We are tonight having our last talk here and there. Talmud, as I say before, it's thank God for our sponsors, and thank God, I want to say this year, my own behalf and on yours, for the shuls who have stepped forward and very generously volunteered to share their what shall I say, space with us. It's your benefit, and very comfortable. But between Bet Tefillah and their Talmud here tonight, everybody's been very, very nice about it, and Shomer Yamuna, And I think it speaks very well that the shuls and the other institutions of the community have an appreciation for what we're trying to do over here. Next week, Shomer Emunah. Right, that's as the signs go. I don't see too many college people. I see some college professors, but you can't come for the reception next week. We need the college students. But Rabbi Mark and I will be seeing over there. All right, without any further ado, let me get down to the body of my remarks. As you see over here, we're talking about Zionism and Judaism, uneasy cohabitation, which raises, of course, the very interesting question of the relationship between Zionism on the one hand and Judaism on the other, which is not a simple matter. The state of Israel, if you want to get down to it, is a creation of three types of Zionism. Political, cultural, religious, as you see the three iconic figures over here in the next slide. Herzl, of course, represents the political Zionism. He's the one who made it. Acharam on the other end, cultural Zionism, something quite different. And Rav Kook, of course, I think is an iconic face for co-religious Zionism, even though he was never a member of the Mizrahi party. Not many people know that. Now, that's what it is. Political and cultural Zionism are creations of the 19th century, never existed before that. Religious Zionism is a little trickier. You know, you might say, it's been back since way back when. It's in the Siddur. You might say differently. Religious Zionism as a movement is also 19th century, to be perfectly honest, the beginning of the 20th century, as we'll see. So what do those terms mean? That's something I want to play around with and talk with tonight. We know what the old Judaism looked like. I've used this template on many occasions. The old traditionalism, which is always consisting of these four pillars. That's always my central argument in many of these talks, between the fundamentalism and the nomianism, the coercive autonomous communities, and the cultural insularity. These are the four hallmarks of tradition of Judaism long ago, for many, many centuries, thousands of years possibly. The fundamentalism, of course, refers to the fact that one believes, Jews believed, traditionally, that the Torah is a historic document. It's not a bunch of fairy tales. It's not metaphors. It really happened. A lot of consequences flow out of those sets of beliefs. The overwhelming majority of Jews at all times and places in the past and traditional times subscribed to a Jewish fundamental. I'm not talking about Christian fundamental. I'm talking about Jewish fundamentalism, obviously. And Torah Sinai and all the other things over there is the notion of chosen people. It's the notion, as the Rambam puts it so famously, that if the Jews are given the Ten Commandments and the others are not, right away on that day anti-Semitism is created. Maimonides' famous observation in his letter to Yemen, and all that. Nomianism, of course, from the word nomian, the Greek nomos, refers to the fact that Judaism is not a matter of beliefs, but of practices. Although there are broad definitions of beliefs, like I say, Torah Sinai, whatever that means, God, whatever that means, this, whatever that means, but there's never been any kind of doctrinal precision insisted upon among Jews, but on the contrary, the greatest emphasis is put upon precision of practice. The definition of a Jew was someone who subscribed, however broadly, to the basic fundamental ideas. And then, do you keep Shabbos? Do you keep kosher? What do you do in Yom Kippur? Do you make your house Pesach and marriage and divorce and all the rest of it? The Jews had to do this because, let's face it, we were people scattered forever in a wide variety, as you all know, of geographical locations and contexts. No state, no church. It's easy to remember that there's no state. We all know there wasn't a state of Israel long ago. It's not so easy to remember. People don't realize no church. The Jews, way back when, ever since Sanhedrin went down the tubes, long ago, never had and haven't even tried to get any kind of a central body to lay down the rules for the rest of the group. There never was, and there still isn't today, any attempt even by all the big rabbis or leaders, whatever, actually to get together in a room and try to hammer out a common position for a Klal Yisrael. Never even tried it. And so how did this religion battle in its existential struggle constantly, the tension between the centrifugal and the centripetal forces? Why didn't we all turn out to be, for example, like the Ethiopian Jews, who somehow or other spun out of there, never heard of the Talmud, and really got off the map? But that didn't happen to the Jews nearby Ethiopia in a place called Yemen, or other places like that, because they're all part of this stuff here, the fundamentals, the nomianism, the Otasu, and all the rest of it. This is the fundamentalism, of course, and the nomianism is centered around the idea of a Torah Shabbat Peh, a consensus among everybody, even though it's never adopted. You understand what I'm saying? There never was a constitutional convention which said we're going to believe in the Talmud and we're going to organize our lives according to the Talmud Bavli. But it happened anyway. I don't know how. Nobody knows how. I always like to say to my classes, we know what the train looked like before it went into the tunnel, and we know what the train looked like after it exited the tunnel. But we don't know how the train did it in the middle of the tunnel, but we know it did happen. And so the fundamentalism, nomianism, simply becomes absolutely key elements of the traditionalism. The Rambam believed in God and all that stuff and providence in one way. Yehuda Levi and Rashi and the Kabbalists believe in a different way, and others believe in a third way. That wasn't the point. They could agree to disagree, but they can't agree on whether there's no room for argument over a question of whether they can light a match on Saturday or whether they can eat a ham sandwich. You know what I'm saying? It's a nomianist kind of thing. The autonomous coercive communities were the places where all this was practiced. Wherever Jews lived, I know many of you have been in my earlier talks, wherever Jews lived, they did not live as we do today as private individual citizens of secular states. The concept of the secular state does not exist prior to the French Revolution. You understand? Nor did the Jews in ancient times have such a concept as a secular state. So if it's a Christian state or it's a Muslim state, obviously somebody who's not a Christian or somebody who's not a Muslim can't have civil rights and equality and can't actually be a member of society. They can only be a stranger living there as resident aliens. That's what the Jews always were, and for a variety of reasons. In all these environments, whether in Christendom in Europe on the one hand or in the Islamic world on the other hand, the Jews always lived as separate communities, legally separate, not in ghettos. Ghettos don't exist till the 1500s, only in Italy and a few other places. There are no ghettos in the other countries, contrary to popular belief. The Polish ghetto, which is something you hear about always in the literature, it never existed. There's no such thing as the Polish ghetto. Yeah, that's right. But the mental ghetto always existed. The legal ghetto exists, meaning the Jews, if they lived, for example, in a town, paid their money to the Jewish community, and the Jewish community pays its money to the state. And the laws are, the Jewish community passes its own laws and coercive and forces them. It's not a club, it enforces them upon the people. It can't be Mechal Shabbos if there to be sanctions, okay? And the host society, for its own reasons, backed this, and the result was what I always call a perfect storm. The Jews wanted this autonomous, coercive environment, and the Gentiles did as well. And so that's where you practice your nomianism. Okay, that's where the laws and the fundamentalism is actually put into place. The Jews are given their own space, and finally, the cultural insularity, which is an issue we wrestle with today. But it's always been a case, and had to be, that the Jews had to be to some degree or another culturally insular. If not, then how are they going to stay in the farm? Okay, at different times, from today till thousands of years ago, some groups were very insular and others were less so. But they always have some degree of cultural insularity. This precedes Zionism and Orthodoxy and all that sort of thing. The old Zionism is part of the fundamentalism. Isn't that true? If you believe in the Torah and the Gemara, oh yes, then you also believe that the Jews are coming back to Israel one day. It's in your siddur. You don't even realize what you're saying. You say, Israel's our country. So what are you doing over here? I can explain. And one day we're going to come back. All right? It should take less time than it's taken. Bummer. But, right? What do those words mean? You say it all the time. What do these words mean? You say you view yourself as a member of a nation, not simply as a matter of a religious group. Judaism has never fit like a square peg in a round hole into the usual definitions, the Western definitions. It just doesn't. What can we do? It's its own thing, sui generis, and it does advocate, as you know, as a key element of the fundamentalism. And I might even say that a lot of the nomianism, a lot of the laws of Judaism are organized around the idea that you're going back to Israel. Okay? If you go like some of the commentators, like the Ramban, all the mitzvahs are organized around the idea that you're getting ready to go back to Israel. So it's a main element of the fundamentalism. It's part of the doctrine of messianism. The Rambam, as I'm sure most know, enacts the notion of a Mashiach as one of the 13 principles, meaning there's no Judaism, in his opinion, there's no Judaism without the notion of a Mashiach. What is a Mashiach in the Jewish notion? Don't give me this Tikkun Olam stuff. That didn't exist. So what is the Mashiach? Somebody's going to take the Jews back to Israel and set up a Jewish state. Read it in the book. It's called the Mishnah Torah, right around Rambam. The Mashiach will come back, they'll get a state of Israel, they'll rebuild the temple, and all that kind of business. So it's all part of the religion in that regard. Those of you who say, I need Mammons every day, I mean, that's part of what you're saying, whether you know it or not. But it's politically quiescent, okay? Which means that part of the culture is so organized, the traditionalist culture is, nobody's actually taking any moves to launch a revolution and go set up a Jewish state. Okay? Is God going to do it? It's politically quiescent. It'll happen. This is definitely a program. This is what we organize our lives for and look forward to, but we're not going to do it. It'll just leave it to God. Had to be. The Jews had no power. Wherever they lived, totally helpless minorities. Wherever they lived in those coercive communities, wherever they lived, it's always of service on sufferance. Isn't that right? The society would not let them in there if it wasn't for the economic benefit. If you're Christian, why would you let in the people who killed Jesus? If you're a Muslim, why would you let in the people who are dogs, worse than dogs? Monkeys, they call them. The answer is of service. But it's on sufferance. Sufferance means I can pull the plug whenever I want. You're in my house. You're a guest in my house. Anytime I don't want you to be here, get out of my house. And so in 1492, they do that in Spain, as you know. In 1290, they do in England, 1304 in France. I mean, you can go down the list. And the Jews don't quarrel with that, because first of all, they can. Second of all, they concede that point. You're on sufferance. What does Shylock say so famously as Shakespeare? Sufferance is the badge of our tribe. Isn't that right? Shakespeare never met a Jew, maybe, but he knew that. Now, in that regard, you can't say we're going to make up a Jewish state. You have to believe in it and just hope it'll happen somehow or other. Such Zionism as existed in traditionalist times expressed itself, therefore, in emigration to Palestine. I mean, there were always some Jews who moved and lived in Eretz Yisrael, although I must say, it doesn't really amount to anything until you get to 1500s. In the earlier Middle Ages, there are very, very, very few Jews in Israel. Second of all, Israel is a total backwater in the Middle Ages. Where's the action happening in the 9, 10, 11, 12, 1300s, 1400s? It's Rashi in France. It's people in Spain, as you know. It's Rambam in a place like Egypt. You know, you can look around the map. It's not going to be in Israel. It's interesting. Not going to be in Israel. Only after 1492, some of the Jews, not all, by a long shot, a few of the Jews start moving back to Palestine. It's before the Turks come in. The first Turks take over 30 years later. They start moving to Eretz Yisrael. The Bartanur is very famous. The rabbi from Italy moves there in 1490. And from that time on, Eretz Yisrael starts to have small but significant Jewish communities. Before that, they had small, insignificant Jewish communities of bad people. The Trumas Hadeshin is one of the biggest rabbis in the 1400s, a very famous Ashkenazi rabbi. And somebody writes him, should I make Aliyah? And he says, Israel's good. The Israelis are terrible. Don't go there because they'll rip you to bits. And he says, I'm not happy to say that because I don't have to tell you, this person was a great Jew who wrote this. But the situation was what it was. But later on, things change. And after the 1500s, 1600s, you already start to see significant people, figures move there. In the 1500s, Eretz Yisrael, for the first time in 1,000 years, more, becomes an important center of Yiddishkeit because of Olim. Who moves to Israel in the 1500s? Rabbi Yosef Karo, people like that, who writes the Shulchan Aruch, the Ari, who writes the Kabbalah, and people like that. These outsiders who moved to Israel, and it's pretty much that way in the 16 and 1700s. So if you're Jewish and you want to be a Zionist in those years, you make Aliyah like the Shlah or something like that, or you send money for the people who are there, because most of the people come without money. The ones that come with money can invest, but the ones that come without money have to live on the dole. Well, there is no dole, so you have to get money from overseas. Okay, and so Jewish communities spontaneously around the world did do this. Is this Zionism? Well, yeah, kind of. The Chazon Ish is very famous for saying, you know who really started the modern Israel? He said this. The little old ladies back in Lithuania and Poland who always put a little money in the pushka when they bench left. Because in the old days, long ago, you had a little Eretz Yisrael box. I'm talking about when the JNF did not exist. Okay? Long ago, but it was part of the culture. that every time you ben schlicht on Friday night, you put in a penny or whatever you have in a little box, and that money is destined to go to Eretz Yisrael. And that's the kind of thing that is mimetic. You pass it from mother to daughter, from parent to child, and it becomes part of your, constitution. And what is that? Now, then we come to the modern era, so-called, and you come to the 19th century, and with the unraveling of those four pillars. I've spoken about that at great length at other times, but the modern era is when most Jews either give up all or some of these. Isn't that right? They give all or some of this. Under the impact of modernity, moving around, moving to other places, you can forget about cultural insularity. Everybody's going to get a secular education sooner or later in the 19th or 20th century. And the kind of cultural insularity I'm talking about was in the old days, or like you have now with the Haredim in Israel, there was zero secular education. That didn't exist much. Autonomous coercive communities goes down the tubes with the French Revolution and its aftermath. Once the state gives Jews civil rights, as it will in every country, willingly or unwillingly, happily or unhappily, but it happens, then ain't no autonomous coercive community. You're a citizen of the United States, you're not a citizen of some religious corporation. They have no coercive power over you whatsoever. Nomianism, well, we all know most Jews stopped keeping Shabbos, to use a code word, in the course of the 19th, 20th century. That's part of the modernization process. Fundamentalism, not so simple, is it? Does everybody believe in God and Torah Sinai and all these kind of ideas and the Talmud and Torah Sheba'al Peh? As you go through the process of secular education, of modernization, of Europeanization, of Westernization, and all the other Asians that we can think of, it's not a great picture in terms of that. What really happens is that the old model, and this really, I hope you'll memorize these, not that I'm giving you a test, but the reason I want you to memorize is these four together really held all Jews together. All Jews all Jews, I wasn't there, but just about all Jews subscribed, really, in one degree or another to these four. And because of that, I might live in Lithuania, but I feel totally in common with a Jew from Yemen. I might be in Morocco, but I feel totally in common with a Jew in Persia or in Russia. And I know there are differences between Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and all that. I'm well aware of that. But with all the differences, at the end of the day, we're kind of the same. You see? When this starts to fall apart, we find the modern experience of Judaism, of Jews, which is one, unfortunately, as we know today, of different reactions to modernity, fractionation that cannot be fixed. We're all holding by Humpty Dumpty fell apart, and nobody can put it back together again. You tell me, how's the Orthodox, the Conservative, Reform, the this, that, and the other ever going to get back on the same page? Do you honestly see that? Again, I'm not happy about this. I'm just telling you, this is the experience of the Jews in modernity. How do you, all kidding aside, how do you put it back together? You understand? Once the consensus is shattered, how do you create a new consensus? Now, many people talk about it, but I never think they're able to put it together. Okay? And so, the question we're going to address tonight is, where does Zionism fit in the fractured, shattered consensus? Okay? How will Jews, starting in the 1800s, and unfortunately down till today, how will they react to questions about Zionism? In other words, that the Jews want to move back to Israel, want to have some kind of a state there, the centrality of this. You might be a Jew living in Germany or somewhere else, but really you consider yourself a member of some invisible, unknown yet, but coming Jewish state. How's that going to happen? How are people going to react to this in the context of the shattering effects of modernity upon the Jewish consensus? Well, Jews who convert, for example, are obviously out of the picture. A lot of Jews are going to convert as a result of modernity to get a job or for other reasons. They're not going to be Zionists anymore, okay? Jews who assimilate are going to be out of the picture. Jews who assimilate, not Jews who acculturate. So now we talk about the modern period in Jewish history, we have to use those fancy words. Acculturate means you acculturate somewhat, but you still keep some of your Jewish stuff. Assimilate means you do it to a heavy degree, and there's practically none of your Jewish stuff left over. And so the Jew who assimilates in the 19th and the 20th centuries, we know right well, today we all know people like that, they're not interested in this stuff and Israel and Zionism at all. Right? Not at all. They're checked out. Reform Judaism, well, one of the things that's going to happen is, with the shattering of fundamentalism and nomianism as a universal consensus kind of position, new types of Judaism will rise in reaction to it. I'm not going to go into details about it now, we've done it in other times, but one variety, for example, in Germany and the United States in the 19th and 20th century is going to be Reform Judaism. They're going to reject Zionism in principle from a theological perspective. Okay? A classic Reform Judaism in the 19th century, obviously, and early 20th century, was opposed to the notion that the Jews want to go back to some other country from where they're living. They said, as is very famous, Berlin is Jerusalem, or Washington is Jerusalem, whatever you want to say, and we like it here now. And they would say to the Orthodox, you're a bunch of hypocrites. If you say one of them is Israel, say go. What do you live in Baltimore for? At least we're consistent, they said, right? You use the words. We want to get rid of it out of the siddur, or at least we want to make it consistent with our lifestyle. You all are using false. Okay? And so right off the bat, that's an important group that's going to, unsubscribe from notions of Zionism. Conservative Judaism, which will arise in the 19th century, liberal Jews, they used to call it in Europe, will retain a politically quiescent sympathy for Zionism, but they want to modernize the Yishuv. Here is one of the most famous conservative Jews in the 19th century, Heinrich Gratz, the most famous historian the Jews ever produced. And he's one of the founders, the three founders of conservative Judaism in Germany. And he's very famous, very interested in Israel, makes a trip in 1872 to visit Yerushalayim. But his trip, he's like this. He wants to Germanize everybody, right? Well, he looks around at Mea Sharma, as we would say today, and think, doesn't like this is not what we want. We want something that's, more up to date and all the rest of it. And so it's going to have a complicated and, funny attitude towards the question of Zionism. If we can recreate the United States and Israel, well, that's what we want. I get it, but it's not so easy to do that. But nevertheless, conservative Judaism, part of its self-definition and its inner persona will be one which does indeed sympathize, it's interesting, with Zionism. Conservative Judaism rejects fundamentalism, but they embrace nomianism. It's kind of funny. And part of nomianism is, part of the Jewish way of looking at things is always at the centrality of Israel, whatever that means. So you see there are different kinds of, what about Jews who formally secularize? Because that's going to be another category that's going to emerge in the 19th century. The Jew who says, I'm not converting to another religion because all religions are baloney, so why should I convert? I'm just checking out. I'll be a secular person, be an atheist, to use a blunt word. And where do they stand on Zionism? It's an interesting question. That's a group that's going to be very, very, very interesting in the formation of Zionism. Seminal influences in the formation of the Jewish state. I repeat again, seminal influences in the formation of a Jewish state. There are different ways of secularizing. The most powerful in the 19th century, Marxism, of one kind or another. To use a simple word, socialism or communism. Karl Marx, we'll see, was from Jewish parents, but he was born already baptized, and his way is going to be very anti-Zionist, very anti-Jewish also. But Marxism, as a principle, says that all nationalities are bad. Right? There should be one human race, period. And anything involving any sort of nationalism whatsoever, French nationalism, German nationalism, and so forth, Russian nationalism, is negative. And the Jews, that's even worse. They don't have a nationalism. They want to create one. That's even worse. You see? And so to them, Zionism is a poison word. So if you're Jewish and you're young and you convert to Marxism, and who here, I'm not going to ask this question, who here does not have relatives, alive or dead, who one time or another were socialist or communist or something like that? I see three liars. Right, but you understand. But this is Rav Aaron Kotler had a sister who was a communist, so it was no big deal. He says the thing is that this has swept a great deal of people, and there is a baggage with it. If you buy into this, then one thing you're going to do is be in principle opposed to any kind of Zionism. Not necessarily though. One of the most interesting people in this regard in the 19th century is Karl Marx's Chavrusa. A close friend of his who became a post-Marxist. And in his post-Marxist phase, became a Zionist, long before anybody else. That's the next guy over here. Moses Hess, not so well known, right? Moshe Hess. Born in Germany in the early 1800s and all that. He is the guy really who wrote the Communist Manifesto. I mean, he was buddy with Karl Marx. Comes from a frum family. His grandfather anyway had smicha in Bonn, or in others in the old German things, old German ways before the Yeka was invented. Seriously, and then he ends up at a young age switching to nascent socialism. He is one of the closest friends of Karl Marx. The two of them together put together the ideas that the rest of the world will know as Marxism, including all the atheism stuff and all the revolutionary stuff, the critique of capitalism and everything that goes along with it. It's a very fascinating kind of, as I say before, kind of a relationship. So these are two guys. Marx has a bigger beard. Together they come up with all their ideas, but look what happens over here. As Hess goes out among German workers, and they have the famous revolution of 1848, and he's trying to liberate them, and he talks to the other proletariat. He says, these guys are really anti-Semitic. You understand? Now, you're not supposed to say that in the Marxist movement, but these guys are pretty doggone racist. They hate the Jews. Now, what many Marxists will do from then till today is swallow that, pretend it's not there, and continue into the Marxism. Nobody has the courage to say the emperor has no clothes. I mean the workers. I mean the proletariat masses. That they're all a bunch of hilarious because they're totally full of anti-Semitic hatred and they don't deserve nothing. Nobody's got that, but he does. He's an intellectually courageous guy, and he breaks with Marx. He says, what are you doing? You're trying to push kind of movement, and you're saying nationalist differences will be sublimated in some kind of new world order in which will be all one mankind. I know one thing: everybody hates the Jews. What are you going to do about that? And Marx says, you're retrograded, you're backward, what you're talking about. And this starts him to thinking. He kind of breaks away from this guy, starts using his own mind. Karl Marx is not like any friends that use their own mind, meaning you can always think as long as you conform with me. Okay? Do you know anybody like that? No, anyway, and this guy has the courage of his own convictions. He puts years into it. He was a big author and all the rest of it. He ends up writing a book called Rome and Jerusalem. And Rome and Jerusalem, it's around. It's in English also. And it turns out he's fascinated with the Jewish tradition. I would say half the book is him engaging critiques and close analysis of the writings of Samson Raphael Hirsch. It's kind of interesting, yeah. Karl Marx's buddy. And let's go to the next one. Yeah, it's kind of, I take your word. Now he critiques him, he doesn't like it, and then the other, but he considered him with great respect. It's kind of interesting. And in I say 1861 or 1862, after all this, he writes this whole book, and he basically says like this: national differences are not going to go away. That's some pipe dream of Karl Marx. That's baloney. The national differences are going. A Frenchman's going to be a Frenchman, and a German's going to be a German, and both will hate the Jews. Right? A Russian will be a Russian, an Italian will be Italian. They'll all hate the Jews. That's the way it goes. Either you want to say the emperor has no clothes, or you want to be in a fantasy land. I'm telling the truth. And so what's the solution? A state of Israel and Palestine. Okay? So this is 35 years before Herzl. This book was not a bestseller. I can tell you No, I'm serious. It was not a bestseller at all. He does not have, as we'll see in a minute, what Herzl had. But Herzl writes in his diary, after he wrote his whole book about the Jewish state, he says, I just found this book in an old bookstore called Rome, and this guy has everything in there. I never heard of him. You see? He's absolutely right. And it comes, as I say before, no, but what's my point? It's an interesting story, but what's my point? There's such a thing called an assimilation Jew who's post-assimilation. You get it? You can undergo a process in which you go through assimilation, but then after a while, as a recent author has put it so well, assimilation has its discontents. You don't find the nirvana necessarily, the paradise, in assimilation. That becomes almost a topos, a key factor in the modern Jewish experience. It's not the only one, and there are Jews who find nirvana in the assimilation experience. That is true. But very, very often you find not that way. And then the question becomes, so how do they deal with all that? And some of them, like this guy, very interestingly, will say, it's back to Judaism. But what does it mean back to Judaism? They're not going to be frum. They can't buy into the fundamentalism anymore. certainly, as he would put it, he can't buy into the nomianism because he kind of does believe in the fundamentalism. There's a pintalegid, as people talk about from time to time, and there is this notion, that you feel, as Hess writes, he said, I feel there's a destiny of the Jewish people, there's some force guiding it, but he says, but I can't be no Sanskrit Hirsch and worry about how big my tzitzis are, and the pots and pans of the milchig and the fleshig. No, he can't go into all that stuff. And so you went out, you want to come back, you don't know how far you can come back, you're not interested in coming back all the way, because that's not what you're interested in. Okay? But you also don't want to, but you want to do something. Zionism. Well, that's what he came before that word even existed. But he says, the future has to be in some kind of a Jewish national existence. He would say, and so will the other Zionism, that of the four pillars, this is not so important. Look what I'm saying now. This is not so important. This is not so important. This is not so important. This is important. Maybe we can scratch out this. Maybe we can scratch out this. But this is very important, community. The essence of the Jewish experience is community. The ikra of Judaism is kehillah, klal Yisrael. Now, to be perfectly honest, those who know, there are quite a few statements to that effect, interestingly, in rabbinic literature. And the Gemara in place like the Agarata, they'll talk about klal Yisrael being of a super hypostatic reality of its own that transcends general categories, very well-known mystical, but it's in the Talmud as well, often in there. The Jewish community really has a magic power. And you'll find, I'll give you an example, the spices of the ketoras that you all know what I'm talking about. The good spice, the bad spice, and the other thing. The ketoras, as we know, is offered in the Holy of Holies, or right in front of the Holy of Holies. Those in the inner altar. The lulav and the estrog, famous thing that you find in the Talmud. The good Jew, the bad Jew, the good smelling one, the bad smelling one. Again, you all know what I'm talking about. Deep significance, mystically, as well as otherwise, in the Jewish tradition, the notion of the community. That if all Jews get together, that's just a powerful, powerful kind of force, and God likes it. You read the writing of Mesilas Yesharim and people like that, the responsibility of all the Jews is to try to pull their share, to do the best on behalf of the community. The chassid in the writings of Luzzatto and others, the real chassid, the real pious person, is not simply the person who practices the religion very well, but does so with the specific kavanah, with the specific intention of trying to be ma'aleh, to lift up the rest of the members of the community through their own actions. These are the communitarian dynamic is an extremely powerful one in the Jewish tradition. It's not the only one in there, and the Orthodoxy will embrace that, but also insist on fundamentalism and nomianism. I understand that, but I'm telling you where these people are coming from, and the Zionism therefore will come out of and respond to this very, very interesting and kind of controversial, notion over there. And thus you see that there's going to be a strange kind of face of Zionism vis-a-vis the Jewish religion. It does emerge out of deep, deep roots. Within it, it doesn't totally conform to, what is generally considered the basic features of all of it, but it'll, argue, and it does, that these are not as important, I repeat, not as important as this. And there's your fight down till today. Is that not true? There's your fights down till today. And so, and that's assuming that Judaism is a religion. Is Judaism a religion? It's a lot more than a religion. As I said before, that's a square peg in a round hole. When you try to take secular categories and you try to impose them upon a phenomenon which is kind of sui generis. So for many Jews then, Zionism in 19th century and 20th century will be their way, successfully or otherwise, of re-engaging, or perhaps engaging, with their religious heritage, even if they cannot fully buy into their heritage. That's exactly who Theodor Herzl is. Right? He's a post-assimilationist Jew to some degree, but he's an assimilated Jew, that's for sure. Herzl was born in Vienna, and he was the Paris correspondent for the big Viennese newspaper, like we would say today, a super correspondent or something along those lines. And he will, how should I put it? He will go through all the phases of assimilation. Go to university, he does marry a Jew, but they practice nothing, they know nothing. He had from grandparents, as they say. He knows that. But he has a Christmas tree. And, when the chief rabbi of Vienna visits him, they serve him, I remember, like shrimps or something. I never heard it wasn't called. Everybody's heard of ham. Not everybody's heard of the shellfish. And I'm just telling and yet, somewhere along the lines, they romanticize it, but somewhere along the lines in his 30s, he starts to go through a post-assimilationist phase precisely because he's successful in the Christian world. He sees the intense anti-Semitism that, I don't know if that's the right word. He sees the Jew does not belong. That's a better way of putting it. Okay? The Jew can't really be a part of Europe, even though he is. And therefore, he looks in a complicated way at his assimilation, and he wants to, do something about it. But how do you go back? He can't be fundamental. He can't be religious. He's a secularist, which means everything he learned in college and afterwards teach them atheism, as I say, to put it in simple words. And so the idea of having an epiphany is going to go Baal Tshuva, that's not going to happen with him. But he wants to be Jewish. So how does one do that? You understand? He's definitely post-religious. He recognizes, like Hess, that the religious, element is the core of Judaism. He writes this in his books. How can I be Jewish? But Judaism is the religious belief and all the rest of it, but he can't buy into the religion. It's a dilemma. He's not the only guy. He's just a famous example of that. And so Zionism, because you all know he comes into Zionism. He comes up with the movement. He talks like Hess did. Let's have a Jewish state in Palestine, reconstitute Jewish people in that way. That becomes his way of trying to connect to a Jewish core that his secular persona and lifestyle keeps him away from. It's kind of interesting to look at it from the outside in. And this was indeed what attracts many other Western Jewish intellectuals, Germany and France and England, places like that, and students, to Zionism. They want to be Jewish. They don't find it possible to go back to Jewish religion. In other words, it's not what happened in America in the last 30, 40 years when you find people who simply say like this: I'm going to become a Baal Tshuva, as the expression goes today. I'm going to embrace religion. They may have been secular, they may have been something else, and they decide for whatever other to go through a real lifestyle change. That's a sign of the second half of the 20th century. Maybe even better to say for the last 30 years or so of the 20th century. That become typical. That was not the case prior to that. It almost never. Instead, people want to come back, but they can't, or at least they feel they can't come back to the religion. And so what you do is you try to come back to Zionism. Liberal religion they regard as a joke. None of these people say, I'll go back to Reform Judaism. It's interesting. Herzl or anyone else. They say they look at it like the Israelis. It says that's a joke. But you understand? They say, oh, it's fundamentalism, it's nomism, but I can't get into that. Everything I know tells me that that's not true, and how am I going to do it? And so that's why Herzl will articulate a political state. As for his religion, he leaves that up to the Jews. That's the key to his writings. It's all about setting up a state of Israel. Once the Jews go there, they'll figure out what to do as far as the religion goes. Let them have the fights, like every culture does, and let them battle it out. Look, when Herzl was alive, most of the countries in Europe had big battles over religion. That's kind of normal. France has huge battles between right and left throughout the 1800s down to the Second World War over religion. I would say, and would you not agree with me, that a good part of American politics in 2012 has to do with religion and not. Okay? Different politicians play it each way for their advantages, they see it, but religion is a powerful force which turns on and turns off. Okay? That's a fundamental feature of the time. And so Herzl will say like this: just like in America they're fighting over what religion should be there, should there be gay marriage, should there not be gay marriage, should there be abortion, should there not be abortion, with this and that. So let them argue it out over there. His feelings towards religious Jews, therefore, was interesting. He couldn't be religious, but he understands that these guys represent a kind of, as they say, religious core without which Judaism would not have been able to survive. It's not clear what he sees the future. He was kind of political and cynical in this regard, but there's no question in his view of things that the religious Jews are going to be the core of the people that moved to Israel. He actually went to a bunch of Hasidic rebbes because his thinking was like this. You go to one guy, and he can command 50,000 people to go. So it's instant Aliyah. Makes sense. The Rebbe's thought he's crazy, so they didn't go along. But he visited the Sadiger Rebbe and others, and the idea was, you command the allegiance of a lot of people, and tell them to go. You understand? He also had that attitude, by the way, to the millionaires. He said, I'll go to Rothschild and Baron Hirsch, and it's like, you got a bill. What's a billion to you? You know, like Dirksen said, a billion here, a billion there. Maybe eventually you talk about money, but until then, it's nothing. You want to know something? He was not wrong in that. Rothschild had the money to burn, and the Hasidic Rebbe's at that time had the followers to spare. It just didn't happen. But this is his whole idea. He also realizes, and pay close attention to this, as a politician, that a Zionism, which is rejected by all Orthodox Jews, will have no traction in Christian Europe. This becomes a key element that you must understand as we go through all of our discussions from then till today, that the non-religious Zionists, the secular Zionists, were quite aware that even though in their mind religious matters are backwards and not true and all that, but if you're going to look to get support out there, you're going to need support from Christians, many of whom, for one reason or another, are going to be moved by the religious side of the argument. And so if Herzl will be part of a group that says, I want to start a Jewish state, and all the religious Jews in Europe make a wall from one end to the other, from right to left, and they see Herzl being an atheist, therefore it's talking about something that's totally out of Judaism, he would get no traction. He wouldn't get to talk to the Prime Minister of Germany or the head of England or something like that, because he could not claim to have a real following, and he would be delegitimated in their eyes. This is something that Chaim Weizmann, who was a super atheist, and the others discover early on. Balfour is moved by religious considerations, as we'll see. Lloyd George is moved by religious considerations. They weren't moved by cold-hearted British political considerations, because they're in favor of that would be favor of the Arabs. Harry S. Truman will be moved by religious considerations, whether you want to admit it or not. You understand? I told you before, he writes in his own memoirs, his favorite verse, and he read the Bible every day, and his favorite Bible passage is the 137th Psalm. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. Okay? Don't tell me that this is out of nothing. So how can you come and say, I represent something Jewish, this religious junk, and that's where I want to set up a state of Israel. On what basis? Well, we had something thousands of years ago, so what? Yeah. Unfortunately, my friends, you have to invoke the religion in order to make the case for it. That's what Herzl realizes early on. So eventually, whether they like it or not, Weizmann, Nachum Sokolov, eventually Ben Gurion, and all the others, most European statesmen who sympathize with Zionism will do so, partially or wholly, out of Christian religious motives, which means they believe in the Bible. If you tell me you're an atheist and the Bible doesn't exist, then what are you doing in my room? Okay? And so all these secular or atheist Zionist leaders will always end their speech at the League of Nations, the United Nations, with a pasuk or two. But it's true, right? Chaim Weizmann is very famous, telling Abi Ben in 1946, he says, throw in a pasuk, make it from Yeshaya, or whatever it is. That's what he says. Get it? Now, you could be cynical about it, as perhaps he was, but it resonates. And what it really means is that the religion is, in many regards, one of political Zionism's most potent cards, for better or worse. You understand? It's a card. The Bible, they know in Africa. The Bible, they know in Norway. You know what I'm saying? Herzl's book, Moses Hess's book, and that kind of stuff, nobody's heard of. You see? And so to drop the Bible is to drop your A-bomb. Okay? And these are part of the facts of life. They cannot, in that context, Zionism cannot afford to be delegitimized by united orthodoxy, and that's a basic fact of life. You just have to understand it. Now, in Herzl's case, he found an ally in this person, Rabbi Reines. It's him over there, who eventually founded the Mizrahi. You know, Rabbi Reines was a big rav in Russia. He went to Volozhin Yeshiva, as you can kind of tell, and he was rav of a town. Lid is not far from Vilna, a real Litvisha, and all that. He was what we would call, by the standards of Lithuania in the 19th century, he'd be considered modern Orthodox, not by standards of America. By that kind of thing. I mean, but seriously, his modern Orthodoxy expressed itself in two regards, and they'll go together in our story. One is his interest in affiliating politically with Herzl, and number two, his interest in having some secular studies in yeshiva. Right? This is a precursor, but a very weak one, of YU. The learning there is like every other yeshiva, but they have a few courses. And you could eventually get a pharmacy degree and a couple of things like that. This was very far removed from a university or anything like that. But even that little bit was considered extremely controversial in his time. But as part of that, he's looking for something progressive within a totally frum Eastern European, Lithuanian Orthodoxy at that time. And he gets traction. I mean, let's go to the next one. This was his Rosh Yeshiva. Anybody knows that? That's the Metzger Eloi. One of the biggest Lithuanian Gedolim and all that 20 years ago. But he was the Rosh Yeshiva under Rabbi Reines and the Yeshiva in Lida. Talmud Muvak of Reb Chaim Brisker, if that means anything to you. I mean, that's really true. It's not just an exaggeration on my part. And super this, and that, and the other. By the way, he ended up eventually in YU after the First World War. And anyway, here you have a personification of the fact that Herzl can claim, I have a following among the Orthodox Jews. Maybe not all of them, but I would say most of them prove me wrong. Okay? Prove me wrong. The famous sign, 100 years ago in America, a guy puts up a sign in New York, a chief rabbi of the United States and Canada. And they say, who made you the chief rabbi of the United States and Canada? He says, the sign painter. He says, why the whole country? He says, that way in order to fire me, they'll all have to get together. That will never happen, The point is, go prove him wrong. Rabbi Reines says, I have people who are card-carrying members of the Zionist movement once it's set up by Herzl in 1897, and they paid the shekel as it's called, they are card-carrying official members. There is no such thing as a Mizrahi movement yet. They didn't have parties in the beginning, 1897, 1902. There are no parties in Zionism. You're just a member of the Zionist party. You can hold this way, that one can think that way, another one can think a third way. These are the Orthodox ones, the religious ones. They have members all over Russian Empire, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and that, in Hungary, and in Bohemia, and Austria, and Vienna, and places, Germany certainly, and places like that, and some other places as well. So no, there's a movement, and these will be Jews who say, listen, Herzl's not a from Jew. We're not looking to ask him any shalos about kashrus. But he does seem to have a way and a possibility to possibly pull off to get a Jewish state. I can't meet with the Pope or the President of the United States or the Prince or the Kaiser or something like that, and he can. And so let's see where it leads us. Get it? And he's not trying to impose some other religion or anti-religion in Palestine. At least that's what it seems. And Herzl, indeed, if you know the politics of the early Zionist movement, is indeed not seeking to, he's trying to hold on and trying to get whatever following and traction he can get to try to make the case that he represents a mass movement. When he goes to Russia in 1903 and Kompleva meets him, he's the head of the KGB at that time under the Tsar in Russia, and Kompleva says, I know you're the leader of the Jewish masses. All they got. Not elected by anybody, but nevertheless, if you see a whole bunch of religious Jews, it kind of seems that way, you see? One of the myths of Zionism that they'll be able to use very successfully is they represent the elders of Zion. That all the Jews around the world are part of them. That's what Chaim Weizmann is able to pull off, as I explained to you already, in First World War to get the Balfour Declaration out of the British. They think he's got the magic card, right? Press that button, and the Jews everywhere will do whatever he says. So, look, is what it is. Now, Rav Reines is not a Rav Kook. He wasn't somebody of the super stature and the great thinking and all the rest of it. He's quite content to play second fiddle to Herzl. Rav Reines was a realist. He was a big Talmud Chacham, was a realist, and he said like this, I can't see the Pope. I can't talk to the President of France. I'm not a guy to negotiate with the Kaiser. Herzl has that. And so we have the old model of the Jewish community. Some people are better in learning. Some people are better into politics. Some people are better in this. For a doctor, I go to a doctor. I'm not a doctor. For a lawyer, you go to a lawyer. And for politics, you go to a politician and a journalist and a statesman. And I can tell you right now that, Rabbi Reines was a loyal follower of Herzl all the way through. The Mizrahi votes for Uganda. I don't know if you know that. 1904, you know what I'm talking about. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. When they had that up for grabs, maybe make a Jewish state in Uganda, which is actually Kenya. Big fight over there. The secular Zionists out of Russia said, no, Lehmann Sion lo echsheh. It's Yerushalayim or nothing. The Mizrahi vote for it, right? Because they say like this: we're following Herzl through thick and thin. He seems to know better than anybody else what to do. And Herzl said it's not going to be a permanent thing. It's a step on the way to Israel, and let's do it. I'm just trying to show you over here that this notion of the second fiddle, playing a subordinate role within the Zionist movement, becomes a permanent and definitional feature of the Mizrahi movement. Some liked it, some did not like it, but that's what it was. Okay? Meanwhile, at the same time, a different trend is arising at the end of the 19th century in Russia. That's cultural Zionism associated with the Chana'am. This is a different model. There's a Chana'am, there's a young Chaim Weizmann over there, you can see over there, who is the cousin of the Elbaums over here. Now, they tell me they can still recognize the family resemblance. Now, but really, these are principled atheists. And these are people coming out of the third wave of the Russian Haskalah who want to redefine Judaism. Okay? It's not Herzl who says, I guess I got nothing to do with the religion whatsoever. I just am, who I am, and I'm trying to negotiate my own kind of relationship to the pre-existing Judaism. They say Judaism has been misunderstood. It never was religion. Well, it was a religion, but religion is not its essence and its core. Judaism is a nationality. It's a nationalism. And the wisdom of the Jewish nationality is that when they lived in the Middle Ages, the only way you could survive was by adopting a religious kind of mode. And so the national genius organized itself that Judaism presented itself as a religion. But really it's not. Okay? And it's a secular one. These are people who are late 19th century European intellectuals. They buy into, obviously, Charles Darwin and all the other things that go along with that. And, they have a completely secular view, but they still want, on the other hand, be Jewish. Why is a discussion question, but they do. And they therefore want to redefine Judaism. It's the first time you ever get this. They want to redefine Judaism as something quite different than what it's been before, and something quite different from a religion. And they're militantly anti-religious simply because they say the religion is false and it's the wrong way to go. And Judaism, if it wants to survive in the 20th century, will have to shed its religious nature. Otherwise, it'll lose totally the attraction or interest of the younger element, and they'll just totally all assimilate out. So we represent the only chance for the survival of Judaism. It's a principled, as they say, atheism. And like Voltaire, their slogan is "Écraser l'infâme," crush the infamous. No, religion has to be uprooted out of Jewish society. They're not saying shoot anybody, but it's got to be something which all the young people eventually get out of it, so it dies with the old. That's basically what it boils out of here. Now, Herzl was opposed to this. They wanted this to be Zionism. I don't want to get too detailed over here, but Chana'am and the others, they were not interested, believe it or not, in a Jewish state. They said they want a Jewish center, cultural center in Palestine with something different. Chana'am said there never will be a Jewish state because you got the Arabs there, number one. And number two, you never have a large enough Jewish group. You can never settle more than 250,000 Jews, tops, in the whole Palestine. And what to do with the rest of the Jews all over the rest of the world, and so on and so on and so forth. He had this pessimistic kind of nature, if you know who he was. And the result is they wanted Herzl and the Zionist movement to espouse boldly this post-religious and anti-religious kind of stand. Herzl is totally opposed to that because he said, I got all these religious Jews I'm allied with, and so they totally oppose Herzl. And if you know the history of the Zionist movement, which is kind of ugly, as all movements are, then there's a lot of bitter fighting between these guys and Herzl in the years 1900 to 1904. In 1900, these guys, for the first time, 1902, these guys, for the first time, start a separate party within Zionism, right? To advocate within Herzl was very angry at this, their own party, to advocate for anti-religionism as a matter of principle. And the goal, to conquer the kehilot, as they call it over there, to take over through elections and through political agitation in all the communities, change the schooling, stop the brainwashing of the kids in a religious direction, and institute instead of brainwashing of the kids in an atheist direction. That's when they do. Rabbi Reines responded a few months later by founding another party within Zionism called the Mizrahi. That's how it happened. You understand? The Mizrahi Party was founded in reaction to the founding of the anti-religious party. And then Zionism, let's put it this way, this is the beginning of the curse of Miflaktiyut. As we all know, Zionism will become a whole bunch of different parties that they are down till today by tearing each other to bits. But that's what happened. In 1904, Herzl dies, and to make a long story short, the Achad position becomes the dominant one within Zionism. They took over the movement. Herzl left no other Herzl. And so these guys took over the movement. Again, I don't want to get too detailed over it, but Zionism, therefore, will be there. Their disdain for religion, it has to be balanced, though, by a kind of cold political perception that they cannot afford to be delegitimized by United Orthodoxy. Right? And so Weitzman, this is exactly Weitzman. He hates religion. He'd like to get rid of them, can't do it. Need them for the pasuk in Yeshayahu, you know. And hence, the Zionist movement will have a Machiavellian approach to the Mizrahi all the way through, certainly down to Ben-Gurion's time and afterwards. You need them, you want to use them, you can't totally get rid of them, but you hope one day they won't be there, you know, all that kind of stuff. And makes life kind of interesting if you're a student of the Zionist movement. Meanwhile, there's a third thing happening, and that's the rise of a Marxist Zionism, which really should have been an oxymoron. Because Karl Marx is against religion, he's certainly against Zionism, and all the real Marxists, the starker Marxists, are super anti-Zionist. I'll give you an example, Trotsky, you know, and people like that. And yet, in spite of what I said, people are more powerful than consistency. That's the trouble I always have with my friends who are mathematicians and scientists. They're nuts, as I always preach, of consistency and order and efficiency and logic and all the rest of it. And people aren't like that. That's what makes history cool. So so you'll find people rising in Eastern Europe particularly who say, we do believe all the ideas of Karl Marx. We do want to be religious, or we don't want to be religious. We want to be Jewish. Zionism is the way to go in order to be Jewish and not religious. Karl Marx said it can't happen. We'll make it happen. Okay? It's not an oxymoron. It's an oxymoron. And so you have brothers and sisters and families to fight over this kind of stuff. Right? They won't talk to each other. They have big battles. A really abstract, ideal kind of political principles. Can one be a Zionist and a socialist and a this and that and the other? But this, as I say before, is what makes, you know, Jewish history in the early 20th century so interesting. In principle, these guys are opposed to religion, but they're conflicted, either out of nostalgia or out of their intellectual unsureness concerning the nature of a secular Judaism built from but detached from the religion. So whatever they say, they don't feel comfortable in a pure Marxist kind of direction, but it's kind of inconsistent. Let me put it this way. If you are Marxist, why Palestine? Right? Why? Is there no mystical content in Zionism? Are you supposed to be against all mysticism? It's a hard question to answer. You know, after the First World War, the socialists will take power in the Zionist movement, but they'll have to continue their connection with the Mizrahi because of the reasons I said before. And, you know, why are you so interested in Eretz Yisrael? If you're a Marxist, why do you want to go and bust your head trying to build a kibbutz in some horrible weather in the middle of the, you know, Jezreel Valley or something like that? Now, Rav Kook is sitting there and smiling and laughing. I'm serious. This is when he lived. He says, I know what you're thinking. You don't know what you're thinking because you won't admit to yourself what you're thinking. You see? This is why he was in favor of Zionism. Because he says, along the lines I'm telling you, it's the Jewish side of you trying to come out. You just can't re-engage with your religion. But eventually you will. And they say, you know, and there you go. And so the result is, by the time you get after the First World War in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, there is a religious movement, Mizrahi movement in Israel, but the fights, as we said before, the Mizrahi will go along with the powers that be. They'll play second fiddle. The fights are over turf matters and Tammany Hall kind of things. Who gets an extra job here, a piece of land there, build a school in the third place. Because they had the exact attitude towards Chaim Weizmann that they earlier had towards Herzl. Weizmann knows Balfour. Weizmann can talk to the Mussolini, which is true, and to all the other leaders of the world. We can't do that. We're a bunch of schleppers. Okay? We know how to run a shul. To run a shul is not the same thing as running a world. And so let him do it. We don't like the fact that he's not religious. You know, I understand all that, but we're willing to hold our nose and do it. It's just interesting. And that is what happens. In the 20s and 30s, there emerges a militant anti-religionism in the Mapam movement, what eventually becomes the Mapam movement, under the influence of a seemingly triumphant Soviet communism. we forget, because today we look at the communist movement like something went down the tooth, which it did. But 100 years ago, or 80 years ago or something like that, people really believed it's a workers' paradise. And they really believed that they're implementing a pure Marxist state and all that kind of stuff in Russia. It's a joke today. We know it was under Stalin, but I'm talking about what they did at that time. And therefore, these Marxist Zionism will be very, of the extreme left, will express their Zionism and their Marxism in an extremely anti-religious kind of attitude. These are the guys who fight with Ben-Gurion when he establishes the state. They don't put in God in the Declaration of Independence. You know that story, right? He said he wants his Ben-Gurion thinking about Truman, so let's put in something for God, with a trust in the Lord of Israel. And they say, oh, absolutely not. And eventually they say, okay, Tzur Yisrael, we're placing our trust in the Rock of Israel. And Rabbi Maimon says, Tzur Yisrael v'go alo. And Mizrahi said, Mapam said, no way. You know what I'm saying? And so just Tzur Yisrael. And what's that all about? It becomes a key feature, and a very important one, I'm sorry to say. The Mapai Party, which is emerging as the largest of socialist parties, will wrestle with the issue of how militantly anti-religious they want to be. There's a famous story. Baruch Katznelson is the #1 theoretician of the Mapai Party till his death in 1944. He was the main guy there, him and Ben-Gurion. And very interesting. Now, he's post-religious, and he's a socialist, and all that kind of stuff. But it's famous that 1934, the Mapai organized Tiyulim on Tisha B'Av. Okay? Well, it's like having dances in Yom Kippur. Get it? And wait a minute. So they had this all over the place, and he writes a famous article criticizing it. And he basically says like this: Tisha B'Av, a Jew should feel different. It's not the day for Tiyul. Now, why? I mean, he's treif. You see that conflictedness that lies at the core of all this sort of thing. He wants to create a secular culture, but out of the religious culture. That's what he always writes. And therefore he says that, you have to give the religious settlers a shul and a yarmulke and all that sort of thing. You have to try to show some respect. Although the long-term plan is that everybody will move out of religion once they transcend this whole business. Essentially, what you're talking about is a confusion of ideas, which Rav Kook is standing there and saying, ha, 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 okay, as I said before. And this really does happen. But you wouldn't see it so much in the 1930s. Instead, you saw Tiyulim on Tisha B'Av, a dance in Yom Kippur, and all the rest of it, which is an expression of the fact that you feel you have to do something, against. Okay? Now, you can get very Freudian and all this, but I'm not going to go there. Obviously, if you're not from the Mizrahi community, this is all treif, right? And a large proportion of the religious Jews will totally have nothing to do with Zionism and all the rest of it. They'll look at the Mizrahi as a bunch of Uncle Toms, as they do all the way through, and a bunch of sellouts. And everything we're talking about over here, if you're talking about a Judaism, which is divorced in whatever fashion from fundamentalism and nominalism, which are the two key elements. I mean, cultural and solidarity, you can take or leave. And autonomous coercive communities, you can take or leave. We don't have that in America. But the fundamentalism, if you have the belief in the Torah, of the idea of the mitzvahs, and say you're doing something Jewish, there's all treif, okay? But this is how life was in those years. The Zionists have the Balfour Declaration. They have the Mandate of Palestine. They have the official position with the League of Nations and the British government, and they have the institutions of power that they are creating from scratch. Right? Ben-Gurion, of course, is the closest friend of Katznelson, equally confused in matters of religion. That's going to be a key part of our story next week, because after 1948, it's the Ben-Gurion hour. That's when he's the top dog. He's the head. And he's going to set the policy over there, and he's also, pulled in different types of directions. On the one hand, you certainly see the ugly face of anti-religionism. For example, with the Tehran children, when the war comes around, where these kids escaped from Poland. We talked about it last year, a sad story. These kids escape in the war. They're able to, kids, get out of the German zone, get into the Russian zone, and because Stalin is now allied with Churchill, they eventually let him go to Tehran, and then they can go to Palestine. When they get to Tehran, they're taken over by shlichim from the Sachnut. In other words, Mapai and Mapam Madrichim. And they cut their payas, they tell everybody to eat treif, they try to mix the boys and the girls. I mean, they do. No, they torture the kids. I'm sorry to say. They persecute the kids to be anti-religious. Because a lot of these kids have run away from Hasidic homes and whatever. And what kind of mentality is that? That's the mentality. It does come out, you will see this, and you'll see this later on when Ben-Gurion is in charge over there. So on the one hand, you have this ugly side On the other hand, you have this kind of respect of one kind or another, the Machiavellian respect for the religion, the non-Machiavellian respect for the religious tradition, which they realize is core and they're trying to relate to, but they don't know exactly how. It's very fascinating. You can go Google this. Ben-Gurion has a correspondence when he becomes prime minister with a Rabbi Dolgin. Does anybody remember him from L.A., I think? Right? Yeah, that's right. So he was a big Mizrahi rabbi. Was that Beth Jacob? Am I right about that? Yeah, right. The shul, the big shul in L.A. Rabbi Dolgin was a big Askoki guy, and he was a big Mizrahi leader. And he entered in a very interesting correspondence, which was published in Commentary magazine. They're back and forth Ben-Gurion, and basically, it was a high-level thing. What do you believe in? Why should somebody be Zionist? You're angry at the American Jews not moving to Israel, but what do you offer? What is Zionism? And Ben-Gurion tries to use all kind of cliches. We believe in the Bible, the Book of Books. We want to create a new nationality out of the core of the Bible and all this. And he says, out of the Bible, do you believe the Bible actually happened? What about the laws about the kashrus or something like that? And by the time it's all over, Ben-Gurion says, I have nothing more to say. It's up, I give up. And it bespeaks the kind of religious confusion that I'm talking about over here. Because can you have a nationality? I'm going to speak at high level now. Can you have a nationality with any religious content whatsoever? The famous 19th century apostle and the most famous person connected with nationalism in the modern sense is Giuseppe Mazzini, the famous Italian, but maybe you never heard of him, but you should have. He's a very famous liberal and a fine man, and he was a friend of the Jews. He was a friend of all oppressed people around the world. And he fought that Italy should be a state that's united, independent, and free of the domination of the Catholic Church. Okay? So a very interesting guy. When you go home, you can Google him. He's, by the way, the hero of Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin. So Mazzini was against clericalism. He's fighting against the Catholic Church and all this kind of stuff. And he says very famously, listen to this closely, religion and politics are inseparable. Without religion, political science can only create despotism or anarchy. Religion is the highest educational principle. Politics are the application of that principle to the various manifestations of human existence. That's it. But it's true. In other words, what are your values that the political system is supposed to make happen? Or do you have no values? If you have no values, Stalin will move in. Right? And so when you think of somebody who's a great intellectual, and then you start talking about all this vapidity that I'm displaying over here with this thinker and that leader in the Marxist movement, the Zionist movement, all the rest of it, now they realize at some level, and they may have known about Mazzini's writing, but that doesn't mean they're willing to come back and try and embrace Judaism. All non-religious parties in Israel are united until today on anti-clericalism. I don't blame them about that. Anti-clericalism means one thing about the religion, the other one, do you want to be ruled by rabbis? Do you want to be ruled by the religion until people tell you what to do? So that's a big, powerful factor in the anti-religion. But how do you separate the religion from the clericalism? That's something the Western world as well as the Eastern world is always battling with, But it's really, if you go beyond the superficial, and I can just, I can't take you with me all through that, but if you just have to take my word on this. If you go beyond the superficial, you really will see very interesting the emptiness, the cultural and religious emptiness of atheism, from most of the leading political Zionist figures that emerged in the state of Israel. If one reads the biographies, for example, of Yaakov Herzl, who's Herzl's son and becomes a very famous Israeli diplomat. This is the brother of the president of Israel, okay? Talmud Chaim Herzl, this is his brother, who was a big Talmud Chacham, an Orthodox Jew, a leading Israeli diplomat. Really leading, he was one of the top Israeli diplomats and representatives. He was number 3 guy to Ben-Gurion, and later on to Eshkol and all this sort of thing. He was a big guy, and he has these very interesting relationships with people like Ben-Gurion, Moshe Sheret, Eshkol, and Zalman Aran, and others, all the big machers over there, who in their unguarded moments say to him, how do you do it? And what do you do with all the religious questions we have? And is it possible for a person like me to have any kind of connection with the religion? It's very interesting, when they let their guard down. Or Leo Kohn, the famous German Jew, who also became the big legal expert for Israel's foreign policy in the 40s and the 50s. He's the one that wrote the Constitution that didn't happen. He was an Orthodox Jew from Frankfurt, surprise, surprise, and Mizrahi Jew, obviously. And he wrote Israel's Constitution. But as I told you, Ben-Gurion was interested in Constitution. So it gets complicated, very interesting. And then you, of course, have the effects of the Holocaust on all this. the Holocaust has a very funny set of effects. As many of us here know, or old enough to know, you didn't want to talk about it for 20 years. Isn't that true? People did not want to, and my parents do. Perfectly understandable. Perfectly understandable. So you didn't want to talk about its long-term effect. But the white elephant is on the table. What does this do in terms of problematizing the notion of trying to have a secularist society without any religious content? What does this do? And you can play it both ways. Where's God in the Holocaust? That proves there's no God. Or else you can say, where's man in the Holocaust? That proves there's no man. And do we want to displace traditional Judaism in favor of ideals purported by a European culture, if you want to boil down to it, which proved its utter failure in the time of the Holocaust? The crisis of Western culture, which has led in thinking circles in Western Europe to postmodernism. No, they didn't like modernism anymore. And so it gets very complicated in all this. It's also true that all during this time, the Zionist movement is painfully aware of the effects of the Haredi rejection of them all the way through. They never accepted Herzl. They never accepted anything after Herzl. And the others know it. And numbers are big numbers. There's a lot of people in the Haredi world. We're talking about the Hasidic world prior to the Holocaust. We're talking about the other groups over there. They're well aware that the Mizrahi and the others are under pressure from them all the time because they're viewed as, I say, selling out over here. There's a struggle in the Haredi world, by the way, over Zionism during all these years. Basically, when we talk about the Haredi world, I'm using modern terms, there's left to right, like everywhere, right? Even in the Torah Karta, there's left to right, correct? Some people still go to Ahmadinejad, and some say don't. So there's no such thing as a group that doesn't have left to right. So the frum world, so to speak, the Haredi world, has a left to right. It expresses itself, among other ways, in its position on Zionism. The left, if I can use this term, is looking constantly for some way to make an accommodation with Zionism. There are constant conferences held in the 1930s at the home of Reb Chaim Grushinsky, no less, over the question, can the Good and Mizrahi somehow get together? They can't, but they're trying. And there are other attempts over this, but particularly during the Hitler era, when it kind of was staring you in the face that the Jews somehow or other have to get together. The Aguda movement, as we call it in Israel, the Aguda means it's not the Torah Karta. They have a break-off in the 1930s because the Torah Karta feels the Aguda are sellouts, just as the Aguda felt that the Mizrahi are sellouts, because they're willing to start cooperating in one fashion or another with the Jewish agency to get a few more certificates and to help build up Israel, whatever it is. And yet, this is balanced by all kind of other factors. Then there's Ben-Gurion's need, as the 1940s come along, and getting closer to Israel, and they want the state of Israel, and they want to get United Nations recognition from the rest of the world, and they have to say to themselves, as I told you last week, the provisional government is elected by nobody. But they're going to want, that's the guys at the table who proclaim the state of Israel. They're a bunch of unelected who's. So they want to say, but we represent the Jewish people, the Yeshuv in Palestine. Well, how do you know? So you got to get everybody aboard. Ben-Gurion needs the Aguda. You can't get the Torah Karta, but you got to get the Aguda on board. Okay? And this is when they will have horse trading, and they will be successful in doing that. I told you last week. The Aguda signs the Declaration of Independence. Levenstein, Mosey's thing. I think Abitchemeyer Levin, the brother-in-law of the Ger Rebbe, and others, they signed the Declaration of Independence along with the others. And so, does this mean there's a uniting on Zionism or not uniting on Zionism? Not really, but you know what I'm saying. It's problematizing or making more complex the relationship of Judaism and Zionism. Ben-Gurion, at that time, as part of the deals to get the religious party on board, establishes what you and I are familiar with, and we cultivated the status quo. Israel recognized Shabbos as an official day of rest. Okay, you can't get fired if you take up on Saturday. The government offices are kosher. Things like that. We ate. I was in a restaurant a couple weeks ago. I was in Israel, and somebody said like this: "Oh, you missed it. It was here yesterday or something like that. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Israeli General Staff was all here in this restaurant." And the guy who was with me said, "It's in a kosher restaurant, something like this. If it's official, you got to do it." Right? Nebuch, General Dempsey, and the other guys had to have kreplach, but I'm saying, yeah, no, because it's the law. So I'm just saying these kinds of things come part of the status quo, which therefore results in Israel being that wonderful oxymoron. It's a secular state which sanctions religious coercion, right? And it's the only state in the world I know of outside of Islam that does that. Right? Is that true? You know what I'm talking about. Can't get married or divorced in Israel without the rabbi. Let's put it this way. If you're a Cohen, you want to marry a Grusha, it ain't happening. Right? You can be in love. I could write a great movie about this and all that. It's not going to happen. Right? Not yet. Okay? It's not happening. And Israel, so is Ben Gurion the head of a secular state? It's kind of funny. Israel will not enforce nominalism or fundamentalism, but they will enforce this in their way. And that remains the case, as I say, for the next 60 years. So this is reflective of the confusion, or better yet, the history that I've been trying to outline tonight. This will get more complex with the Sephardic Aliyah, which you know is going to double the population of Israel in the first couple of years after Israel is created. The Sephardim coming in from their countries are not coming from a post-secularist, Marxist, etc. They're coming from Yemen. They're coming from Morocco and places like that. In which case, they're coming in with this, right? Am I saying that every one of them is a Shomer Shabbos the regular way? We all are familiar with this model in Israel of many people, in the morning go to shul, in the afternoon go to the beach, or go to the soccer game. But they buy into this and to this, they do that. You see? And what's that going to do with the idea of the kind of state built on cultural Zionist, Achad Ami and Weizmannite principles that they were planning to, it's going to upset all that. Now, again, this is complicated because the government will, and this is something I'll probably talk about next year or whenever, they will have a repeat of the Tehran children. It's a sad thing. Many of the Olim who come in from Morocco, from Yemen, from Iraq, and places like that in North Africa will be forcibly de-religionized. They cut their payas, they take the children, put them in the secular kibbutz, and all that kind of business they do to violently separate them from their religious heritage, which we know never works because all it does is bring blowback. The result has been a bitter divide in the Israeli body politic, which is doomed to left after 1977. You understand? Who voted for Begin? Who votes for the Likud and all the other guys now Shas? All the people who, when they vote for these parties, are doing their best to punch them up high in the face. Because you did this to my parents, you did this to my grandparents. That's a fact of life in Israel. Okay? The protest vote is still there. I just saw somebody the other day in Haaretz, a left-winger, saying, we've been out of power all these years, why are you still beating us up? But it doesn't matter. This was slightly modified when they brought in 1 million Russian Jews. And one of the reasons they brought in Russian Jews, including many people not Jewish, was to outbalance this. Because already starting in the 80s, the direction of the Sephardic preponderance in the voting, and therefore voting on the right, as they say, was already very powerful. So it looked like the Likud forever, and then they balanced it with the Russian. But now that's gone out of style also. They're back to where we are 20, 25 years ago. And it's coming out of these issues, the resentment that was bred by this brutal treatment, as they see it, of here. This is something I'll discuss more in the future. Let me conclude tonight by pointing, as I'm sure many of you know, there's wonderful coincidences out there, but if I just say the word Haaretz and the new poll, you know what I'm talking about? Right? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Not so many people. But they just took this new, released a poll 2009, and the Haaretz is going crazy. And the reason is like this: shocking figures on the state of religion in Israel today, and it's all on the right. Okay? Take a look at the next line. Howard did it. Here, let's jump to the next one. Let me use one that'll be easy to explain to people. Yeah, let's stop here. This is 1993. Okay? Look at this. This is nuts. 98% of people put a mezuzah in the front door. Isn't that interesting? 90%. I mean, that's one over there. Now, if you talk over here, how many people like Shabbos candles? How many people go to shul on Sunday morning? Not too many. Woo, all right? How many people don't work in public on Shabbos? 40%, 42%. Pesach Seder, 78%. I mean, you see the numbers, right? How many people do kosher at home? Okay, 70%, and so on and so forth. No pork. Now, the numbers go higher. Let's go to the next one. How many people believe there's a God in 1993? 2/3. Okay? How many people in Torah Sinai? Over half. How many people believe in schar v'onesh? Good words are punished, good deeds are rewarded, and bad deeds are punished. In the high 50s, close to 60%. How many people believe in Torah? I didn't say how many people keep Shabbos. You understand what I'm getting at. What are your beliefs? And this is of the Israeli public. It's of everybody. It's the religious, the non-religious, the secular, the Masorati, across the board. These are the aggregate numbers. They're coming over here. How many people believe there's another world? 1/3. How many believe Mashiach is coming? 40%. And so on and so forth. Now let's go to the next one. Now let's go to one after that. It is the easiest one to do. These are the recent numbers. How many people believe in God? 80%. How many people believe in schar v'onesh? Good deeds are rewarded. 80%. How many people believe that a higher power runs the world? What we call hashgacha. 77%. How many people do aveiros are punished? 75%. How many people believe that tefillah helps? 72%. How many people believe the Jews are a chosen people? 2/3. How many people believe the Torah is from God? 2/3. How many people believe in Olam Haba and life after death? Close to 60%. Coming Mashiach, half. And how many people believe that a Jew who does not observe the religious precepts endangers the whole Jewish people? 1/3. These are, isn't that interesting? Now, what's really funny is that, let's go to the next one. Again, these are just, these are the different, the figures registering the difference. Let's go to the one after that. Again, to what degree do you observe kashrus in 2009? How many people never eat pork? 72%. How many people eat kosher at home? 73/4. How many people eat kosher outside the house too? 70%. In other words, in the house and out. How many people, milchig and fleshig? 2/3. That's interesting. Don't you agree? What it means is we've moved, if this is accurate, we've moved very far from a lot of what I discussed tonight. Now let me make a very important point. This does not translate into orthodoxy, meaning into quote-unquote party line thinking. The same polls show, are you in favor of gay marriage? A big majority, yes. Are you in favor of all kinds of abortion and things like that? Large numbers, yes. They're separating out the hashkafa side, what they call orthodox, which is right thinking. They say like this, don't tell me what to think. But when it comes to practice, so we're really moving back in Israel, if these numbers are indicative of any kind of a trend, moving back to some new form of traditionalism. It's not going to be exactly identical, at least yet. It's mutatis mutandis, as they say. It's going to be whatever the differences are. But they're moving back to a world a lot closer to 1911 than to 1912 than to 2012. You know what I mean? 1912 than to 1950. Let's put it that way. Isn't that interesting? And what's doing this? Are we going to say that the wonderful example of the Haredim is inspiring everybody to keep? I think the opposite. So then what is it? You see, these trends are deep and emerging, I would argue, out of the kind of things I've tried to show tonight. That the Zionist enterprise itself, being in Israel and having to defend the concept of Israel as well as physically defend, call into people's own beings this kind of tension, and they resolve it however they resolve it. I'm like cruel a little bit by nature, so I like the fact that these guys, let's go to the next one, are going crazy. If you look in these are the left-wing columnists of the Haaretz, and if you want to have fun, read the columns this past week because they say like this: the sky is falling. I'm ashamed to be in a. This is what they write. I'm ashamed to be in a country where 80% of people believe in God. Where have we gone? I kid you, I'm not making it up. How can I face my European friends? What's wrong with us? Even in America, it's only 55%. This is terrible. And where does it go? What will be tomorrow? You understand? Where is it going? This guy is the head of the Israeli Atheist Society. He really is. And he's saying like this. He says, we have to rethink our strategies and all this kind of stuff. We have to now introduce atheism into the public school system. We've allowed the other guys to get away with murder and so on and so forth. And where's it going to go? Now, nobody is what's interesting. I mean, I love this because nobody's willing to say it's half full and half empty. If people do believe, if these figures that I showed you are accurate, I have no way of knowing. If they are accurate, then we're pretty safe internally against the foreign propaganda getting into Israeli minds. You get what I'm saying? Now, the people believe in God and believe in this and believe in all the rest of it, they're not going to buy into the kind of general media world propaganda that is constantly hammering away anti-Israel themes. Right? The way these guys buy into it. Okay? So I would think the glass is at least half full from the nationalist perspective, but that's not how they see it. You understand? So this will be continued, but you see that the consideration even of Zionism and Judaism, which is why I call it an uneasy cohabitation, yields the most unexpected results and gives a great deal of food for thought of which way are things going in the future. Good night. Again, if any